Every day you and I get bombarded with negative news. Just like the body becomes what we eat, the mind becomes what we're putting in. It is important to listen to stories that not only gives you hope, but also inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we're interviewing experts who will break down the solutions to the world's most pressing problems. And I promise you, if you listen to this podcast, you will not only stay informed, but you will also feel more energy in your life. Welcome to Greatcom Talks with. Greatcom is a philanthropic project where we're donating 100% of the profit towards the most effective cause areas. We're trying to help rainforests, we're funding climate change technology. And if you want to help us in that mission, the best thing that you can do right now would be to subscribe to this channel. The topic of today is inclusive virtual learning. And what is that and why does it matter? And to understand more about that, we have invited Sabia Prescott from New America. So I want to say, Sabia, welcome to this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go into inclusive virtual learning, help us understand what is the problem that New America and yourself see in the world that you would like to help solve?
At the highest level, an inequitable U.S. education system, right? On a smaller, much more tangible level, the parts of this issue, or maybe I should say the manifestations of it that we focus on most are instructional materials and pedagogy, which means that we look at the types of content that pre-K-12 students in the U.S. are taught, how they're taught it, how teachers are prepared to teach it, and what biases and lenses it has and how those serve students, or more often do a disservice to students. So we think and talk a lot about this idea of culturally responsive education, which is the idea that curriculum and content should center and reflect students' cultural backgrounds and lived experiences, right? Students should see themselves in the material that they're being taught. The stories that they hear and the histories that they learn about should present them to a world that reflects them, and it should represent them in their own identities and give them the chance to see themselves in the world. And this idea of windows and mirrors, which is now cited a lot in this field, is originally the work of Rudine Sims Bishop and describes this concept of curriculum that both holds up a mirror to students' lives and realities and gives them a window to see into that of others. And so this is sort of the vision that culturally responsive education work still sort of grapples with today, since a lot of textbooks in the US sort of remain lacking in this way. And not only are textbooks sort of not serving students in the ways that they need, but they're also, there's a great deal of variability between curriculum and content from state to state in the US. And so a student learning sort of one topic in one state from one textbook could be learning something very, very different from a different student in a different state. And so that's a real issue when we're thinking about preparing students for a world that includes them and represents them and that they're able to see themselves in and navigate. And so increasingly, we're looking at the intersections of these issues of culturally responsive teaching and issues of digital equity and digital learning, particularly over the last 10 months or so, right? As virtually all students in the US at this point have done digital or remote learning at some point, or are still doing it, or are doing it again, and sort of what the issues are there as well. And it presents a lot of inequities when we think not only about issues of broadband access or device access, right, which is a big issue still in the US, but also when we think about how the technology that students have to use now is serving them or is not serving them, or is actually a tool for them to get to where they want to be and to learn what they want to learn. And so this is really a handful of challenges in one, to answer your question, and they're each sort of affected by a number of policy and social structures.
It really helps to understand that the problem that you're trying to solve would be to help children get, I guess, more education on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give us, do you have a specific example that explains what would be a disservice that we're currently teaching, or in the way we're teaching? Do you have an example that's easy to understand?
Yeah, sure. say a student is learning about history, right? I think that's one of the biggest ones that people think of when they think of culturally responsive teaching. And it's not the only subject where culturally responsive teaching can or should be happening, but it's certainly a big one in the US. So when you think specifically about American history, the way it's presented is really tends to really normalize horrible things that have happened in history, right? Things like genocide, things like slavery, things like colonialism and the way the US was sort of founded. It tends to glorify those things and not only do that, but also present that as sort of the singular narrative of how the US was built and how we got to sort of where we are today, when in reality um, these things are not things to be glorified. And there are many other players or many other sort of historical figures that were present during that time, but don't show up in history textbooks, and would be really important for students to learn. Learn these stories, learn these narratives, learn these people who really have affected US history in very fundamental ways, and who are still really written out of history textbooks. And so I think that's one of the most sort of obvious examples that you hear in the US, at least a lot. But there are lots of other sort of things that show up, particularly when we're talking about other subject areas, biases in things like science and biology, and things like sex ed, and things like English class, and what kinds of authors we're reading and what kinds of stories we're telling. So it really does show up in lots of different subjects.
That makes it more specific and to
Yeah.
understand how history has been glorified. Yeah, I completely agree when you say that. Um, so when I read on the website, it says New America is a public policy institute that invests in new thinkers and new ideas to address the next generation of challenges facing the United States, and it's also a platform for innovation. So could you help us understand what's going on right now that you kind of think is important for more people to understand about?
Yeah, I think, right in this moment, right, there's just so many approaches that we were taking to education, just as broad as that is, have been upended, right? With digital learning comes sort of a whole new slew of challenges and student needs that have to be met. And most teachers and most school administrators and most sort of education leaders in general were not did not sign on, right, to be teaching and to be having to meeting all these demands during a pandemic, and also to be thinking about curriculum in this way, which is sort of its own separate challenge, but is also not completely separate from the issues of digital learning, like I mentioned. And so New America, as a sort of public research institution, um, touches lots of different sort of areas of policy and technology and social issues. I sit on the education team in particular, which is one of the larger teams, and within that, even an even smaller team, which is called Teaching, Learning, and Tech. And so, my small team focuses on exactly this that I'm mentioning, right? These issues of digital equity and culturally responsive education, and where the intersections are. And I describe our work a lot as translation work, right? There are a lot of folks on the ground who are doing this work, teachers in schools, students in schools, education leaders, who really need to understand, need to be able to understand the sort of dense policy language that comes out of DC or comes out of their state and local level policy shops. And so and vice versa, right? Legislators and policymakers need to hear from students and teachers about, what their needs are. And those lines of communication are not always present or easy to sort of maneuver. And so we do a lot of public interest research on what exactly that looks like. And for us, it involves a lot of talking to folks who are on the ground and doing this work, and sort of understanding what it's like for them right now, and what their work looks like, and what their biggest sort of opportunities and challenges are. And so we're hearing a lot from folks right now, that particularly teachers, that they don't want to just return to quote unquote normal, right? As it turns out, normal before was not working for most people. And I say, as it turns out, a bit sarcastically, of course, because this is something that Black and brown women in the field of education have been telling us for a very long time. And people are just now sort of beginning to hear that message and realizing that there are so many things, such as curriculum and content and teacher prep, that were not designed for people who don't hold a lot of privilege. I think to answer your question, at this particular moment, we're seeing one of the biggest gaps between sort of what's being done and where we need to go. And that's where New America is trying to sort of identify the levers there and help the sort of lines of communication both and a broader public understand what's going on here and sort of where we're at.
How does inclusive virtual learning fit into the picture?
Well, like I said, it's something that virtually every student in the US has done since March, or is still doing, or is doing again, right? Or is doing some version of blended learning, which means that they're in class, in a physical classroom some portion of the time, and then doing virtual learning some portion of the time. And so it's really no longer a niche thing. Not that I guess it wasn't ever really, but most schools went from not doing virtual learning at all to doing it full time, at least in March at some point of last year. And so it's something that is affecting everyone right now, right? And it's something that most schools were not built for. Most schools don't have the funding to meet all of the needs that are going on right now. They don't necessarily have the technological sort of forte to be able to navigate all of it. It's a lot to manage. It's a lot to manage for teachers who are holding a lot of hats right now. It's a lot to manage for the students, for education leaders, for everyone involved, really. And so to be able to understand sort of the levers for better funding mechanisms for schools to purchase things like broadband Wi-Fi for students or devices, or more adequate teacher prep to help teachers be able to teach virtually a little bit easier, is something that's really on our minds as we're thinking about sort of how much longer the pandemic is going to be affecting students and teachers in this way, which in the US is unfortunately still something that we really don't know. And so it's as this has become decidedly not a short-term thing, right? We're really thinking about how to make it a little bit easier, how to help teachers and students in this moment sort of do what they need to do, but also beyond that, sort of capitalize on this moment as an opportunity to really change the things that weren't working before and not just return to normal, but rather question the things that we've been doing for a very long time, like teaching incomplete or inaccurate or heavily biased curriculum that is not really serving students, or using technology that maybe isn't serving students, or maybe is, but they're not necessarily prepared to use it. Just sort of various things like that. So there's a lot to do in this moment. I think for most folks, it really is just treading water. This has been such an incredibly awful and horrific thing in the US and I think everywhere, but particularly as our sort of national leadership here has not done its job to sort of mitigate the effects of the pandemic. It has really done a lot of harm to students and teachers and education leaders and families, right? So I think for a lot of folks, it's just sort of surviving at this moment. But if we can sort of question the things that we've been doing for a very long time, we might also be able to use this moment to make some really necessary changes.
Let me see if I can summarize at least my understanding so far. Now that the pandemic has hit us, the whole society needs to be, there's an opening in society to think of a green economy once it's over. So once we're coming out of this, we're going to create this green economy. And are you saying that it's the same thing with the school, that there's an opening in school, the teachers are reflecting upon the things that is not working, and you are then helping the teachers on how to build the new kind of school, the green school or whatever that would be. Yeah, is that so far kind of a summary?
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable comparison. I think the most important part in the education context specifically is that a lot of teachers rather have been saying this for a very long time, and for somehow it's taken a global pandemic for a lot of leaders and federal policymakers to sort of listen and realize that this is really something that has not been working for a very long time. And the idea that this was sort of caused by the pandemic rather than exacerbated it does a huge disservice
Mm.
to the teachers who have been saying this for a very long time. But yes, I think your comparison is right in the fact that we can we can change things, right? That some change can be made so that we don't just go back to sort of what we were doing before, and that the goalpost should sort of be beyond that to something that's better.
And how does then New America fit into the picture of what specific things would you say that you are doing to help that transcendment to happen, to see a better education system? What would that look like?
Yeah, well, when I said translation work, I really mean talking to different stakeholders of this issue, right? So, for example, one project that we just wrapped up involved a roundtable, virtual, of course, as we all are now, where we brought together different sort of stakeholders in this issue, in both of these issues, I should say, of culturally responsive teaching and digital equity. And so that looked like a group of educators, a group of sort of higher ed professors of teachers colleges. It looked like instructional technologists, it looked like curriculum designers, all of these people who are sort of involved in both of, or one or both of these issues. We brought them together to sort of understand what their work looks like right now, and like I said, really just their opportunities, needs, and challenges in this moment. And so a big part of our work is as this role of the convener. And so as we do that, we take what we heard from that conversation and pull out sort of highlights that we think policymakers would need to hear, that we think the general public should understand. And we sort of package it and we put it back out to the world to say, you know, since we do have this platform as the organization, to be able to sort of broadcast this really important information. And so that's something that we just held back in the fall and put out the brief yesterday, I guess. And so we're hoping that that'll be just the first of many roundtables and briefs that we'll have as the result of these types of conversations. But it's one of the biggest things I think that we heard during that conversation was that the teachers specifically who took part in it are really looking for the chance to talk to other folks outside their own school or even outside their own state who are doing this work, policymakers even. And so I think that's where New America comes in as the intermediary there, with this sort of enormous platform to put out this information. And be able to tell stories of things that are working, of opportunities, but also of the challenges and what policy levers might exist to sort of address those challenges.
And so, if I would summarize that, I'm hearing you talk to the stakeholders, you come up with some kind of solution for a new kind of way of doing school. Then you take that to the website and the forum, the platform that you are advocating from, and then other people, other schools could then use that model to implement in their schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's the hope, and that's the work that a lot of that sort of highlighting models that are working type work is something that a lot of other folks on our education team do as well. We're about 35, 40 people in total, I think, and we have folks working everywhere from sort of birth up through higher education and the workforce issues. And so I focus on pre-K-12 specifically, but you know, we've got folks working really everywhere, spanning the whole gamut of education. And so highlighting models that are working so that other states and other districts might be able to look to that for some guidance is really important work that we do.
And I guess that the name of the organization, New America, says quite a lot about what this is all about as well. Sabia, the last kind of thing I want to ask you, unless you have anything you want to add, what would you like? Is there anything that you would like to empathize, that you want people to take with them after hearing this interview, or what something that you like more people to understand?
Yeah. I think that the most important thing is just that this is not a niche issue, right? Which probably is something that a lot of folks say on here, but I think that there's this notion that this is sort of even within the education community, that this is something that is just an issue for other folks or for some people who might be interested in this or have been interested in it for a while, or whatever it is. But this is something that everyone really ought to be thinking about, in my opinion. But also in reality, it's, you know, the content that students learn in schools and the way that they learn it affects all of us. It affects our communities, it affects our schools, it affects all of our institutions. It's really preparing students to exist in and navigate the world, and that's something that really can't be understated, I think. And so that's a lot of that can be really directly related to the materials that they learn from, and how those materials are made and who writes them, and what that process looks like. And so I think when people first think about it, they do think that it's sort of a niche thing, that's sort of, you know, someone else's job, but it is really something that affects all of us. And you can always learn about what's being taught in your own community, in your neighborhood, in your own district. That information is available online. So if you're curious, you know, about what students in your own community are learning and how they're learning it, you can find out, and you can have a say in what that process looks like, even if you yourself don't have kids in the school system or whatever it may be. So that's my call out.